everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, August 7th, 2023, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. And as always, I want to start by thanking those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible each and every week. Remember, Talk Nerdy will and will always be, as long as I'm making this show, 100% free to download. I rely on the support of listeners just like you. And if you're interested in pledging your support, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com/talknerdy. Today's top patrons include Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, David Compton, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo, Joe Wilkinson, Pasquale Gelati, and Ulrika Hagman. Thank you all so much. All right, well, let's dive into this week's episode. It's a really good one, fascinating topic, and I'm always excited when it's something that we really have never talked about before. So we had on the show Dr. Susan Goldin-Meadow. She is the Beardsley Rummel Distinguished Service Professor in the Departments of Psychology and Comparative Human Development and the Committee of Education at the University of Chicago. In 2021, she won the Rummel Prize in Cognitive Science. She's also a member of the National Academy of Sciences and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She wrote a new book that's so fascinating. It's called Thinking with Your Hands: The Surprising Science Behind How Gestures Shape Our Thoughts. So we're going to be talking all about language, development, communication, gestural language, symbols. We dive into so many interesting things, and I just can't wait to share it with you all. So without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Susan Goldin-Meadow. Well, Susan, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
So I'm excited. Yes, I'm excited to talk about your work in psychology, in human development, and education. I'm excited to talk about cognitive science. I'm excited to talk about your new book. Is this, I'm not sure from your bio, is this your first book, or have you written before?
No, I have written other books on
you have?
gesture. I've written a book on the home signing kids, and I've written a book on the gestures that accompany speech. But this is
great. And were those like trade publications, or were they more academically oriented?
More academically oriented.
Gotcha.
So this is the first time I've tried to reach real people.
And it's such an exciting topic. So I think, obviously I've said it in the intro already, but the book is called Thinking with Your Hands: The Surprising Science Behind How Gestures Shape Our Thoughts. And we're going to get into some of those surprises. But before we get too into the meat, I was hoping that you could tell us a little bit about your career. What did you study in school? What was your dissertation? Kind of how did you get to, and then obviously what kind of work have you done since you've been in this professional capacity? How did you get to where you are now?
So I went to Smith College, and I was majoring in psychology, but I wasn't all that excited about it. So I decided to go junior year abroad, just for the experience of going junior year abroad. And I decided to go to Geneva because I spoke French, but I didn't want to study French. So they had a program in Geneva that was really for international relations, not for psychology. I asked them if I could go for psychology, and they said, yeah, well, take your psych courses before and after, and you can go. It turns out Piaget was there.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Talk about walking into something that was wonderful. So I went, and there was another woman from Smith who also went to study with Piaget, and a guy from Princeton who was much more savvy and really knew and came to that program to study with Piaget. So we studied, we took courses from Piaget and from Inhelder and all of his academic professors there, and I got hooked. I got hooked on psychology. I got hooked on developmental psychology. I got hooked on observing the world. And when I came back to Smith, I decided I really would like to go to graduate school and to study language.
It's just to interject before we move into your graduate training. When I think of Piaget, obviously I think of developmental psychology, but when I think of developmental psychology, especially in some of the kind of earlier iterations of it, I think of like a significant focus on childhood And obviously, I think that's changing over time. I'm more on the Gero side of the spectrum with my research, and I see that as like deeply developmental as well. But was it kids that captured you? Like, was there a certain portion of the lifespan that was especially interesting to you?
Well, I have been interested in language from the
Mhm.
get-go, and it's true we use language throughout our lives, but we learn language primarily when we're kids, and we learn it really well when we're kids. So I have focused. I mean, certainly Piaget was focused on early development during the early lifespan, childhood, and not on the later parts of the lifespan. So I had gotten interested, but it wasn't kids per se. It was really language, which led me to children.
Okay. Okay. So you get back, and then you're thinking about graduate studies.
Right. And I'm thinking about where to go to study language. And I had at Smith, it's very close to the Clark School for the Deaf. So I would visit that school. It's an oral school for the deaf, and what everybody said was that the kids really didn't learn to speak very well, but well, some did, and some didn't. But the kids would talk to each other with their hands behind the teacher's back. So I saw it, I witnessed it, and I thought, oh, this is pretty interesting. And this might be a way of looking at how children can invent language. So I went to graduate school with that question in mind, um, and ended up at the University of Pennsylvania, where Lila Gleitman was entertaining precisely the same question. So it was really a match made in heaven. It was a great place for me to go to graduate school.
Oh, I love that. And so, what were some of the sort of outcomes of some of the research? Like, what specific components of that question did you really get to dig into in graduate school?
Well, I started studying with Heidi Feldman, who was another graduate school student at the time. We started studying deaf children of hearing parents who the children were so deaf they couldn't acquire spoken language, no cochlear implants at the time, their hearing aids were not effective, and they didn't know sign language, and their parents didn't know sign language. So they couldn't acquire spoken language, and they didn't see a sign language that they could have acquired. So under those conditions, you might think they'd do nothing or just, do something that's very non-symbolic. But in fact, they started to use their hands to communicate. They gestured. And it's those gestures that I began to study in graduate school, and that I have thought about as the resilient properties of language, because it's the kind of properties that children can invent without a language model.
I love that. And even I think maybe all of us who have been lucky enough to travel to places that are far from home, places with different cultures and of course with different languages, have found ourselves in a situation where we heavily relied on gestures because of the language barrier, where we
Mhm.
had to communicate something to somebody, but we couldn't rely on our words.
Right, right. Now when you do that, you of course have a language under your belt,
Mhm.
so you're a
Yeah.
little different from these kids who really don't have a language. So in some sense, they're telling us what children can bring to language, even if
Oh,
they're not exposed to a language. So that's what I
oh,
found really,
that's
really exciting about it.
fascinating. And did you see that it tended to follow the same developmental course, this kind of invented gestural language, as the developmental course of language learning? Or was there, a different time course? Like, was there a delay?
And for some things, there seemed to be a delay. They might start talking about the past a year later than typically developing kids. But each one of these children is by themselves, in a sense, because it's a deaf child
Yeah.
in a sea of hearing people. So it's not really a shared language, and one might imagine that it would take longer to develop. But basically, the steps that the kids followed were the same as each other, and as hearing kids acquiring spoken language or deaf kids acquiring sign language.
Oh, so you were noticing that there were some almost, shall we say, I'm so afraid to use this word, but shall we say innate or almost natural experiences that followed a traditional course that, obviously was beneath the awareness of these individuals.
Right, right. Yeah, I call them the resilient properties of language, because I have I'm not claiming they're genetic. I'm not claiming what aspects of the biological system are responsible for them, but I am claiming that we people are ready to communicate in these structured ways when we land on the earth. And whether or not we hear, I think we need to have people around to bother to communicate. I don't think this would just pop out because we're there. I think it really requires people. But when this communication pops out, it comes out in a very structured way. And those structures seem to be brought to the situation by the kids, which can, of course, those structures are influenced by the language model if you get one. But if you don't get one, you're still going to structure your communications.
And do you find then that, let's say you never get a language model, like these interesting children that you were studying, would those resilient properties of language be universal? Would they be cross-cultural because they're sort of, I guess, agnostic of a language model?
Yeah,
or are they still deeply affected by culture?
Yeah, I think we have some evidence that they are affected by culture. They certainly are. I mean, in little ways. Okay, so our Chinese, if you imagine an American child showing you the gesture for eat, they might put a little fist or, at their mouths and bob it, an eat gesture. And Chinese children do that too, but they will also put their hands in a V form and shove their hands up into their mouths as though they're using chopsticks.
Mm.
They see a world and they represent the world with gestures and actions, and their worlds are different. Interestingly, many of the orderings that they use. So if you talk about doing something to an object, they gesture and point at the object first and then gesture the action. And that is true in every single culture, whether or not in English, we don't do that. We don't say drum beat. We say beat the drum. But the kids do drum beat in America and in Nicaragua and in Turkey and in China.
Wow. So there's an explanatory value to those gestures that's not sort of tied to our grammatical rules.
Right. It's not tied to, which is one of the ways we know that the kids aren't really learning it from their parents, because the system doesn't even look like their parents' system. It's quite different. And I'm still intrigued by the fact that they have a great deal of commonality. I mean, this is clearly their little child minds coming out and impressing themselves on the communication, but is it natural thought? I mean, what is it? Why is it so robust? And we're not quite sure about where this is coming from, why these orderings and why these patterns.
It raises a question for me, and I don't know if this is an outdated question or if this is still relevant, because obviously this isn't my specific area of inquiry, and I hate to admit that I'm so limited in my knowledge in this area, but I often think about, this concept of like embodied cognition, that we often think in terms of where things are in space, and a lot of our language actually evolved and developed with terminology that probably wouldn't have evolved or developed if we didn't have a concept of proprioception of, where am I? So there's something above me, below me, in front of me, on top of me. Like in all of those words we utilize so deeply in our language, those prepositions. And I'm curious if you see, is that view still kind of like in vogue, this idea of embodied cognition? And also, do you see this in gestural language as well?
Well, I think the view embodied cognition is in vogue. It's not, people mean so many different things by it that
Right.
it's hard to know what we're talking about. I think that, I don't know. I think space is important, but interestingly, for these little kids, they have trouble talking about space and using space, or gesturing about space and using space. So, for example, they might do a gesture of a car going toward a wall, and you can imagine the gesture where one hand is moving toward another hand, which is sort of positioned like a wall. But
Right.
but they don't, at the end of the day, when the car is next to the wall, they don't represent that. The little ones, they just don't represent the final spatial state of next to or behind or in front of or on top of. And then, as it turns out, those concepts are a little hard for them to understand as well. We've given them sort of non-linguistic tasks, and they do less well than children whose languages have those spatial concepts. So it's spatial, but I mean, it is spatial. There's no question it's spatial. And partly what's so important about gesture is that it lays our ideas out in space. But I don't yet know how important space is to the structuring of what they're doing.
It's interesting too, because those are, when I think a little bit deeper about it, they feel there's a physicality, like a spatial component, like you mentioned, but it very easily gets into the abstract. I can imagine that a concept like, let's go over this together, right? It's not over us, it's not over our heads, but we're using the same word to talk about like pouring through information. Again, even through, like we use prepositions in such an abstract way,
Yep.
yet they have a fundamental spatial definition as well.
Right, right. And, I don't know how easy it is for the children are young, so
Right.
they're not going to develop a lot of the abstract ideas at this point. But I just don't know how easy it is to develop those abstract ideas later on. There are people in Nicaragua who remain home signers for their lives. They interact with other hearing people and they work in the fields and whatever, but they don't share a language with anybody.
Wow, that was going to be my next question, was like, did a lot of the children that you studied ultimately end up learning ASL? Do most people develop a shared language at some point in their lives?
Yeah, so the children I studied all learned ASL. They're in America, and eventually they would learn sign language either from peers or in a school or whatever. But in rural areas like Nicaragua or all around the world, you can find adult home signers. People
Mm-hmm.
who really, it's probably not as complicated or a world as the world that we live in with our crazy buildings and our crazy, they basically are living on the earth and tilling the earth and doing those kinds of tasks. And it's okay. They can do it with gesture.
Well, and that raises a really interesting question too, because I know that in terms of, or actually I don't know, but I'm curious as somebody who studies language, is there a parallel also between some tribal languages that happen to be more simplistic grammatically or more simplistic just in terms of like, I guess, breadth or wealth of vocabulary, that like you see these in more rural and sparsely populated areas as well?
So it's sort of interesting because complex languages aren't necessarily, I mean, it isn't the case that small areas with small numbers of people have very simple languages. Often it's the opposite.
Oh.
It's languages that are shared across a wide range of people. And so you have to sort of sink to the lowest common denominator at some level. And, a lot of I think about how English has changed and it's lost some of its details of grammatical structure. So sometimes the languages that are used by a small number of people are very complicated and very intricate.
Interesting.
Yeah, so I don't think that they'll look like home signs for sure.
Interesting.
The way you can get us to look like home signs, people like us, is to tell us to gesture, not talk, and just describe things. And then we start looking like home sign. Because the hearing parents do not look like they're producing home signs when they're talking. They're producing co-speech gestures. And co-speech gestures look really different from these home sign gestures. But if you tell the parents, okay, I want you to tell something to your child and shut up, then they will. We'll do the same.
So a co-speech gesture would be something like when I'm trying to give somebody directions and I'm talking with my hands, but a home sign gesture would be like if I'm playing charades with somebody.
Yeah, I mean, charades is a little complicated because we often make use of sounds in our responses and things like that.
Yeah, but I don't think we're supposed to.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Charades as it should be played. Yes, we call them silent gestures because they are silent. It's without the speech.
Right.
And they are without the speech. They're free to take on whatever form they want. When you're gesturing along with your speech, you have to have your gestures march to the beat of your speech. And so it looks, and there are differences across languages and how gesture marches to the beat of speech. And it has to be integrated with speech. Otherwise, it won't work. You can't do it.
Yeah. Obviously, this raises probably the most important question of the book, or maybe it's not. Maybe I'm misunderstanding here, but a really important concept to dig into and to start grappling with, which is cognition, thought, emergent properties of the brain. However you want to describe this, the relationship between language and really communication as a whole, whether we're talking about gestural language or very complex, grammatical language, spoken language, written language, pictorial language, the relationship between language and thought, the chicken and the egg questions, how each one impacts one another. And I don't even know what question I want to ask, except that I think it would be interesting to explore that connection. Or is it even one and the same? Is language just, I don't know, an emergent thought?
I think we think many, many, many things that we don't express. So language may be a subset of thought, but it's certainly not all of thought. I do think that they are outpouring their cognition in some sense. And it is not shaped by a language model. But it's hard to say these are raw thoughts, raw cognitions,
Right.
But I do think they're not as influenced by trying to make, they do want the listener to understand. Of course, they want the listener to understand. But I don't think they're producing these structures for the listener. And the reason I don't is because they're too simple. If I pointed an apple and I do an eat gesture, that's easy to understand, but it would be just as easy if I did the eat gesture and pointed at the apple. I mean, these are not complicated sentences that the kids are producing. They're producing them in the environment, in the here and now environment. And so the structure feels like it's not necessary for communication, but they do it nonetheless. And that's where I feel like it's, when I speak, I want to be structured. Or when I, communicate, I want to be structured. But we can think in many different ways. Right. We can think in a much more mimetic way. We don't. So I often think that language is composed of our categorical, discrete ways of thinking, along with more mimetic, pictorial ways of thinking, which is conveyed in co-speech gesture.
So you kind of need both of those components to paint that full picture.
That's right. That's right. I really think we need both. So language can't do it all. And that's where co-speech gesture comes in, and it fills in some of the gaps that just, are left by language.
So two questions come to mind that are wildly different, but I want to say them both out loud so I don't forget them because that's how I roll. But answer whichever first feels the most relevant to you right now. So the first one is: do these kids who have this home gestural language that they've developed, do they spontaneously, quote unquote, I know it's not verbalizing, but do they spontaneously gesture even when they're not trying to communicate? And then the other would be, when we look across the entire globe, are there linguistic cultures in which people don't really gesture very much when they talk? Obviously, we know there are cultures where people gesture more. Like, we love to point to Italian culture. It's a very gestural kind of way to speak. But I don't know if that's just a stereotype or if that holds true. But are there cultures where people literally have their hands down at their sides every time they talk and they don't really use as many gestures as you would expect?
Okay, so let me answer the first one first.
Sure.
The kids I have observed these children gesture to themselves.
Right. Okay. Just like any little kid babbles to themselves or any adult talks through, like we find ourselves saying things out loud when we're all alone in our house.
He was looking for something, and so he gestures, where, and then points.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it's clear that those gestures were not intended for other people because, the other person starts to intervene and the kid ignores them. I don't know, or I don't think actually, that the kids would invent a gesture system to talk to themselves. But once having invented it to talk to somebody else, I have observed them use it to talk to themselves. So, but that's sort of communication too. You're communicating with yourself. With respect to the other question of gesturing, we have not observed any cultures where there is no gesture along with speech. Now, of course, we haven't seen all cultures, so maybe we will find one. It also is the case that it may be a myth that Italians gesture more.
Really?
I haven't done the research, but a couple of teams have done the research looking at Northern Europe and Southern Europe. And the rates of spontaneous gesture when you're describing a problem or talking about things are roughly the same. But where they're really different is in things like emblems, like a thumbs up or an okay, or, some of the rude emblems. Italians have many more of those. And many Southern cultures may have many more as well. But it's really an open question about rates of gesture, whether they differ across cultures and whether they differ across people.
Yeah, there may just be richer gestural thesauruses in some cultures.
Right. And they gesture big too. They're
Right.
out there. So you see them, whereas, Swedes in the in the north gesture smaller. No. So they may be less noticeable. But we don't know so much about that yet. I think we need more research on both cross-cultural variability and cross-people variability, cross-individual variability.
Right. So it's like kind of like within cultures as well. Like if everybody has the same sort of language or similar language, are they going to be communicating just differently based on personality, based on familial structures, all that good stuff? I'm curious, and this is so silly that I'm asking you this. I'm looking at the clock from, there's a clock in the background while we're recording. For anybody who obviously cannot see, all of you cannot see what we're doing because this is a podcast. But I'm at the 27-minute mark, and I'm just asking you now, how do we define a gesture? Is it just talking with our hands? Is it body language? Is it facial expressions?
Yeah. There have been lots of books written on what is a gesture. I define it as, well, depends on the categories of things, but I am looking primarily at the hands. But I think face gestures as well. And I wouldn't mind looking at that along with. It's just that it's a lot to code,
Of course, yeah.
So I think the face is being used. It's often used for emotional expression. And so I haven't, although I do have a student who's interested in what goes along with, gesture speech mismatch, what's happening on the face when you do that. But I have restricted it to the hand gestures, the hand movements that we produce in the air. Basically they're not functional in the sense that they're not opening a jar or writing on a page. They are representational. They represent things.
And of course, my mind goes to this next question, which is in individuals who don't have hands, or maybe only have one hand, or maybe they still have use of their arms, but they don't have use of their fingers. Do you find that there are consistencies in these gestures? Or do you find that there's a lot of kind of adaptive resiliency, changes to our gestural capabilities, or that even if you can't actively make the sign with your hand, you're still raising your arm and maybe doing it in your mind?
Right. Well, there are two things. There is an anecdote that's in my book. It's not, I didn't see the patient, but someone who was born without arms who vividly has the feeling that when they talk, their arms are moving. Interestingly, does not have the sensation that when she walks, her arms are moving.
Only when she talks. I
Yeah,
love that.
really interesting. I know. I think it's wonderful. Um, but that's a very extreme situation where you don't have arms. We have observed people who have had their arms amputated either early in life or later in life, and then they do have a prosthesis. And what we have observed, they gesture with their good hand, but also with their prosthesis. They gesture more with their prosthesis if they report that the prosthesis is part of them. Some people feel like their prosthesis is alien to them and not really part of their body. But the ones who have owned it and feel like it's part of them, they gesture quite a lot. It's interesting.
It's fascinating. And of course, I mean, there's just so many your area of research is like endlessly fascinating to me. And I feel like everything we're talking about right now is so new to me as well, because I'm not sure how often it's like one of those things people just take for granted. You know what I mean? We don't often stop to think about it. It's just, well, yeah, we all do that. And I don't know, it probably means something, but it just raises so many questions in my mind. I mean, chief among them, we were talking before about how probably there wouldn't be this spontaneous development of gestural language if people were isolated fully. It requires a sort of intersubjectivity. It requires a sort of being around other humans and a need to communicate. But I would also question whether it would probably happen maybe in a cruder way, just being around things that are alive. So even if those things can't, like my dog can't talk to me, but he communicates with me.
Right. I don't know. We don't, that's a very difficult situation to explore because we don't.
Right. We don't want to make that be an experimental setup. That's for sure.
There was that case many, many years ago of Jeannie, who was discovered at age 13 and had been badly treated by her parents and not given input. And she did not invent a gestural language. But she was also pretty abused. So it's hard to know. I mean, would you gesture to your dog if you're a kid? I don't know. Maybe. I mean, maybe you just need somebody to be responsive.
Right. Maybe that's, because I think that we have our very, I don't know, I hate to even use these terms, but our very sophisticated ways of communicating. And we could probably rank order them from like academic papers, like the most esoteric, the most difficult. And there's even some evidence to show that academic papers over time have become actually harder to read. But everything from that all the way down to very simplistic. I don't like the word because I think it is almost pejorative or minimizing, but sometimes the most simplistic ways that we communicate are actually the most effective.
Right. Absolutely most effective. The least jargon and the more straightforward so that people can understand them.
Right. And you're in a restaurant and it's loud and you'd like to tell, the server that you're working with that you are ready for the check. You don't have to use words.
Right. Now, those are emblems, I think.
So help me understand the difference between gestures and emblems.
So it isn't a gesture. An emblem is a gesture, but it's a type of gesture.
Okay.
And it's a type of gesture that's conventional. They differ across the globe. So in the United States, you stick your thumb up and that's good. If you stick your pinky up, that's nothing. It doesn't tell us anything. But in Taiwan, sticking your thumb up is good, but sticking your pinky up is bad. So they're almost like words, and they can be used without words. So I can tell you something's bad by just sticking up my pinky if I'm in China, and I can tell you that something's good by picking up my thumb in both places. So they're conventional, and they act.
And they're learned, right? Like those are definitely learned.
They are learned.
Yeah.
And they don't. The reason I'm less interested in them is because they don't bend to our whims in a way. You can't do it another way. If you do that okay gesture, the circle with the three fingers up. If you instead of using the index finger, you use the middle finger. That's ridiculous. It looks crazy. It's not okay. I don't know what it is. Maybe don't.
Yeah.
But you have to do it the way you have to do it, and it can be used with speech or without speech, and it's still clear. So it's sort of, it doesn't really capture our spontaneous thinking, or the bits of language that don't fit into language. And that's why I'm less interested in them, because they feel
So then
you stayed.
how would you categorize something that almost feels like it's in between, like it's become codified? Let's say like the choking symbol. We know because it's on the signs. We've learned, like, this is a codified thing that there was an active kind of campaign to teach. If you put your hands around your throat, that tells somebody else that you're choking and you can't breathe and you can't speak. But we naturally would probably do that if we were struggling to breathe.
Right. Well, we tried to figure that out when we're coding these kids. The deaf kids, what they do, interestingly, is they'll take some of these codified gestures, these emblems that their parents use, and bring them into their home sign system. And then they'll use them with other gestures, and they'll use them to talk about things. They'll even change the meanings a little bit. So, for example, if I hold my finger straight up, my index finger, and a mom does that to a kid and says, wait a minute.
Yeah. I do it to my dog all the time. Yeah.
So that's chill out. Okay. So the kids, I've seen at least one of them take that gesture and use it to mean the future. So what he's telling us at one point is he does the wait gesture, or this one finger up, and then does a drive gesture and then away. And what he's really trying to tell us is, it's time for you to go home. in the near future. Go. So
I love that. And it's such an abstract thing that he's making very concrete.
Right. And making use of these emblems that he has learned from the parents. Clearly, he's learned them.
Oh, that's fascinating. So yeah, it's not always clean. Like, and of course, this comes back to like I probably have this conversation every other week on the show. I definitely have it every other day in my real life. This conversation about taxonomy and about categorization and constructing labels, and that not everything is clean. Not everything goes into buckets really well. And part of doing, I do qualitative research now. I used to do a lot of quantitative research, but part of any kind of science that we do is operationally defining how we're going to do it and then trying to have clean categories, knowing that it's all pretty constructed.
That they're going to be blurry lines.
Yeah. And that sounds like a good example. I was very proud of myself when I came up with the choking example, but I'm sure that you're like, yeah, we've seen plenty.
Yes, and those things, if you create it on the spot, it's spontaneous. Even if it looks like something that was created by a culture. So that's the hard part to know. But I do, the home centers, I don't care that they are taking over something that is conventional. When they use it as really part of their systems. It's just integrated right in, which I find fascinating.
And so how, we talk a lot about that relationship again between our cognitions, our thoughts, and then our language, whether those languages be oral or gestural or both. There's a feedback loop here, right? It's not all one way. Like our gestures affect our thoughts and our thoughts affect our gestures, and they continue to sort of build upon each other, right? It's not a chicken and an egg thing.
Right. That's right. Yeah, absolutely. Because these children are without a language, sort of. They're without a language model. But once they've started to put together all these gestures, that's pretty languagey. And so they build on that. And one of the ways in which you can see this being built on is in Nicaragua right now. Sign language is growing up. It's called Nicaraguan Sign Language. Many people know about it. But it began when home centers were brought together about 40 years ago into a school for the deaf. And so they then started to negotiate their own sign languages, to negotiate a sign language. And so this is literally building on the backs of home sign, and the language changes. And then the next generation of deaf kids comes in and learns that system and changes it further.
Was any of that like recorded, recorded
Yeah,
on
people are
video?
studying it now. It was actually recorded on video. And so there have been lots of studies of Nicaraguan Sign Language. It's actually very interesting. And it is a way, and it's not unique. It happens. That's how sign languages grow up. They start
Yeah.
individuals who then come together, share a language, and then teach it to the next generation. Um, so it is literally building, on the backs of, standing on the shoulders of the people who came before you. And you can go farther if you have a little bit of input that is structured.
Well, and how fascinating it must have been, or it must continue to be, to see the negotiation between, and how often people come together and they happen to be using the same sign because probably some sort of almost parsimonious natural experience. Like that just seems to be the most efficient way to communicate this thing. And so it like almost had a, what would you call it, like a convergent evolution, right? Like multiple people came up with it independently versus times when my sign for that and your sign for that are different and we have to either choose one or combine them or, negotiate.
Right. And I don't think anybody knows whether there was literally a negotiation or whether it just happened, and it just
Right.
eked itself out. And then there are issues of structure as well. The kids, often we find that most of the children do exactly the same thing with respect to their structures, but not always, and then so as long as there's one child who has this structure in the sea of home signers, maybe the next generation can pick up on that and grab it and run with it. Because there tends to be typological consistencies across languages. Um,
Yeah. And I'm just curious. And when we think about those types of consistencies, whether it's a typological consistency across languages or whether it's two home signers who get together and realize that they've been using the same signs to communicate similar things. I mean, how much of that do you think is this idea of parsimony? Like that somehow our brains like to be efficient
yeah,
and we like to do things and the universe likes to be efficient, right? We see that in structures all over the universe. Circles, we see circles everywhere, spheres, because it's efficient. And so how much of that do you think is about like resource allocation within our actual, neuronal structure, our ability to do things because they just made the most sense? And that's why it seems like magic, but really it's developmental science.
right. Well, a lot of people have talked about efficiency as a push uh, in our language, a pressure on our language, particularly, with these silent gestures, because they tend to be very much the same. So we have asked adults in Spain and Turkey and the United States and China to describe little scenes. And when they describe the scenes in their speech, of course, they use the structures of their speech. But when you ask them to describe the scenes in silent gesture, that is gesturing without speech, they all look the same. They're exactly the same structures.
Wow.
So there's something coming out here that it feels very, cognitive.
Yeah.
Is the way we
Yeah.
think about it. It may be cognitive for the purposes of displaying something in a manual modality too. I'm sure that has some sort of pressure on the question as well.
This also raises a question for me that I think has sort of become conventional knowledge or conventional wisdom, but from an expert like yourself, it would be really curious for those of my listeners who have young children, whether they are, deaf parents or they're raising deaf children, or if it's a hearing family where everybody is hearing. Very often we think about gestures and teaching emblems, maybe shall we say simple signs, when a child is still so young that they're not yet developing their language, or maybe they're actively developing language neurologically, but they're not babbling yet. They can't actually produce language. I think there's conventional wisdom that like sign is good. Teach your kids signs. They're going to communicate better, and eventually they'll learn their speech. But I'm just curious what you think about that, given your really unique perspective on everything.
Yeah. So this is the baby sign wave.
Right. Right. Exactly.
And what's interesting is that there's not much evidence that it works to promote spoken language acquisition. Even more surprising to me is there's not much evidence to suggest that it eases tensions between mothers and kids.
Really? So that kids can't really communicate their needs any earlier, and mothers can't really understand them any better.
They may or may not be able to, but it hasn't been able to. We haven't picked it up on some tests because it feels counterintuitive. It feels like it would work. And the one thing we do know for sure is it does not hurt, because what you just said before, it promotes language learning. It doesn't get in the way of language learning, because you could imagine that you give them a sign language and they won't even learn to speak.
Right. But that doesn't happen.
It doesn't happen. It really doesn't happen. So it doesn't hurt at all. It may not speed things up, but that's not the only reason to provide it. And it may provide some sort of sense of community between mother and child that we haven't been able to pick up on yet. So I think it's great to do, but I can't tell you that it's great because your kid will learn language better. It's just fine. Do it.
Right. And I wonder sometimes too about like polyglots, about individuals who are exposed to lots of different languages and who develop a skill, a language skill, especially early in life during a more sensitive period of development. I can imagine, but I'm completely guessing here. I can imagine that there's not how do I put this? Like you were saying, that developing sign earlier doesn't seem to facilitate verbal or oral language learning any faster. Well, I can imagine that a child that's learning 3 languages simultaneously is also going to almost look delayed before they show that they have this like intense knowledge.
Right. That does happen. In fact, we have some studies of, these are brain injured children, actually. And the brain injured children are all delayed early on at 18 months. They're all delayed with respect to word learning. They're at the bottom of the normative curve. But half the children gesture at the same rate as typically developing children, and the other half don't. If you look at 30 months and look at what they do, their gesturing doesn't change. The ones who are gesturing at a normal rate stay that way, and the ones who are gesturing at an abnormal rate stay that way. But what you do see is the ones who are gestured at 18 months now are talking in the normal range. They've increased their speech so that the gesture is being used in that case. It gives you a signal that I got this. I'm not talking, which I can imagine, somebody learning 3 languages might do. I'm not talking yet, but I really understand this. And I'm showing you that by my gestures. Whereas the other ones who don't use gesture really need intervention. So I think gesture is useful in that sense. It can be a signal to a doctor or a mother or a father that the kid may need some intervention to get back on track.
That makes sense. I'd love to, just in the few minutes we have left, if you don't mind, share a brief story of something that happened recently, because I would love to get your insights on it. Obviously, it can be broad because you weren't there, but I was lucky enough to travel to Eswatini. It used to be called Swaziland, a very small landlocked country in southern Africa that's kind of surrounded on all sides by South Africa and Mozambique. And I went with actually a group of psychology students here at the university where I'm finishing my internship, almost done. And we did some, interventions there. But one of the schools that we were in, there was a child who also lived in one of the camps, who I bonded with quite a bit. He was 5 years old, and he couldn't verbalize. And, very, very poor area. This kid, we don't know if he had been vaccinated. Nobody really knew where he came from. They didn't know his HIV status. And they didn't really know what was wrong. My guess was fetal alcohol syndrome. Somebody else had a guess of maybe cerebral palsy. But during feeding time, he couldn't really grasp a spoon. He wasn't great. Like his motor control was not great. And I noticed that he was having feeding issues. But I was able to sit with him, almost like mirror with him, and make chewing faces and kind of kick my head back and like make swallowing gestures, and really like I would run my hand down my throat, and he would mimic me, and he would be able to swallow his food. But if you didn't do that, he would just chew, and then it would kind of fall out of his mouth. And it was fascinating to see how readily the gestures translated, even with no language.
Right. That, and how accessible they were. I mean, that says something about him too, because I don't think
because he was
accessible to everybody.
He was so much more cognitively capable than a lot of people gave him credit for. Like, I noticed that too. He was so good at mimicking. Any thumbs up, he would thumbs up right back at you. Any hug, he would put his arms out for you. And if you could figure out how to communicate to him, and actually, I think that his language acquisition was not bad, because sometimes you could communicate to him and he would know what you were asking for. He just couldn't tell you it back.
Right.
But it was really, really fascinating to see the power of gesture when it did feel like there was a language barrier or difficulty, even with some, cognitive concerns. That gesture almost, I don't know, like overcomes even, pretty severe cognitive concerns.
Well, I don't know if it suggests to me almost that they're not a cognitive concern.
Yeah, that they probably aren't as bad as most people give him credit for. That's true. But I think you see it too when you're working with people with intellectual disabilities, that gestural communication is sometimes the best way to communicate.
Right. Yeah, it's unclear, and it probably does both. Gesture may compensate for inabilities, or gesture may just be part of the whole system and reflect.
Right.
And we just don't know. And I bet it does both. And
I bet you're right.
Really think that people who are good teachers and good clinicians and good parents pick up on these gestures that the kids are producing and respond to them and develop a communication with them. And so I think it's used all the time. We just don't always know that we use it.
Yeah, I noticed there was this beautiful example where he had finished his food, and these were kids who were pretty food insecure, and he was pulling for the plate. And of course, in my adult nature, I was like, you're done, and I'm going to put the plate away. But he was like, he was kind of like making a grunting sound, like he wanted the plate. And so I was like, here you go, take the plate. And I didn't know what he wanted it for, but then he went and put it in the bin where they wash the plates, and he put his fork in the bin where he wanted to clean up.
Right.
He wanted to finish the job. And it was really, really lovely to see that he was able to communicate that with me, even though at first I, made the kinds of assumptions that we often make as adults, where we're like, I know what you're trying to tell me and you don't need to do that. It's like, no, I don't know what you're trying to tell me. I need to listen with my eyes.
Right. And really pay attention with your eyes. Right.
Oh, I love that so much. So I know that I've kept you a little longer than I had asked to keep you. I'm just curious, obviously there's so much more we could have talked about. Are there any big takeaways that we didn't even get to? Anything that you feel like, gosh, we can't hang up now. I didn't even talk about X.
No, I think we've gotten to most of it. I think that what's interesting, when we go back to the very beginning, how did I get into gesture, the gesture for the company speech? And I got into that almost as a control for the home sign systems, because the home signers were acquiring their language from hearing, in a context of hearing people, acquiring these gestures. Do they look just like regular old hearing kid gestures? Do they look just like regular old hearing parent gestures? So in order to understand what the home sign system contributes to our understanding about language, I really had to figure out whether it was somewhat unique.
That's fascinating. So that was your control condition. And then you were like, this is so much richer. There's so much going on here.
There's a lot going on there. And I think of home sign as looking much more like sign language than like co-speech gesture.
Fascinating. And it's cool that you can, because of your exposure and because of the deep work and study that you've done, you can probably recognize that. And of course, you can write a sophisticated paper about why and compare this to that. But my guess is that you also can just feel it when you see it. Like, you just know it when you see it.
Right. Yeah.
I love that. That's one of my favorite things about just, I don't know, wisdom and intuition and all of these psychological concepts that sound like magic, but they're really not magic. They're just experience.
Yeah. Right.
It's just been so fascinating talking with you today. And I don't know, I just want to thank you so much for sharing your insights with us. It's been, I don't know, I've just really enjoyed this conversation.
I have as well. Thank you so much for your interest. It's a pleasure.
Of course. And everyone listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.